Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and in the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of living nature, of which we are a part, and with deep gratitude to all the generations before us that have brought us to the present moment, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we complete a 4-day program on leadership. We have been deeply immersed in a variety of global challenges and complexities as the world traverses so many challenges simultaneously at so many levels. Code reds are happening all around. And the question of how humanity both understands and how we act is a question of leadership and how we lead ourselves and lead each other. And lead as a global community with all the diversity that's inherent in what it means to be human these days is the real $64,000 question of the hour. We've talked about corporate leadership over the last several days. We've talked about social leadership. And today we're going to dive into a dialogue with the leaders who convene this panel and get their story, but also their perspective on the paradox of government leading and whether that's vitally necessary and or whether it's an oxymoron, given the way our governments are not leading in the world today. So that's our exploration as we conclude this panel. But before we do, let us just pause, as we always do as we start our Humanity Rising sessions, and just gather ourselves in our bodies, our nature. And let us take a breath, close our eyes, and center ourselves on our hearts. It's our hearts that speak to us when all the other voices subside. And for 1 minute, let us listen to our heartbeat. Let us feel each other. Let us enter into our community here on Humanity Rising as one. Thank you, everyone. Today, we thought we would focus on the two gentlemen who've been convening these dialogues over the last 4 days and also convening other programs on Humanity Rising over the past months with a dedication and sincerity and with an excellence that have brought us an extraordinary array of personalities and activists and speakers and intellectuals and scholars. So I want to bring on Tom Eddington, the founder and CEO of Endangered Global, and George Cappannelli, the founder and CEO of Age Nation. who have demonstrated leadership in a variety of capacities over their lifetime, such that they've been recognized by their peers, not only as leaders, but as role models. And I think have both embodied what, in my view, is the singular test of leadership in our time. And that is that their sense of caring has evolved beyond themselves, their families, their companies, their specific endeavors to embrace the world and the suffering of the world, and how we need at this moment of exquisite fragility to care for everybody in whatever manner that we can, whether it's embracing the challenges of endangered species or endangered democracy. So Tom and George, I just want to thank you for everything that you've done. I want to acknowledge your leadership in Humanity Rising. And so it's my privilege today to dialogue with both of you. And I thought that the best way for us to start would be to have each of you, maybe starting with you, Tom, to tell your story of a little bit more about your background and how you grew up, and emphasize in this case your pathway to leadership and the different situations in which you found yourselves where you emerged as a leader, and what you've learned. And then when both of you have recounted your narratives, we'll engage in a deeper dialogue. Tom?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And good morning, George. Wonderful to be with both of you today. For me, when I think about leadership and my life's journey, my first positions or opportunities to be in a quote unquote leadership position was when I was in high school, running cross country and track, and being the team captain or co-captain. And I had no sense of what leadership was. I had no clue what it meant to be a leader. All I knew was I just needed to get out on the track or on the cross country course and just run as fast as I could, and try and do whatever was possible for me, and try and set an example for my teammates that I would work hard and I would just run as fast as I could. Fast forward to being in college and being elected fraternity president and taking my first leadership course in college and getting some sense of what does leadership really mean. And then when I went into the business world, looking at the leader of my first job out of college, the company I went to work for had 55,000 employees. And just looking at the CEO and his track record and how he got to where he was, and trying to learn from him, working for various managers, and folks were called managers back in the day, and seeing how they were leading or not leading, and how they were managing or not managing. And so my focus was just on observing and noticing inside how I was feeling when I was working for someone. And how did they make me feel? Did they see me? Did they recognize me? Were they exhibiting behaviors that I valued, that I respected? And I ended up leaving my job in part because I just didn't respect the people I was working with and for. And I still to this day, that was decades ago, remember how I felt to not be seen, to not be appreciated, to be not recognized for who I was. And then when I joined my former consulting firm, over a 12-year period, we grew the firm from about 2,200 people when I joined to 25,000 over 12 years. And picking up on some of the conversations this week, particularly from Bob and Jason yesterday, the firm's mission was really simple: do the best possible work for our clients, create an engaging work experience for our people, and make enough money to keep doing the first two. And it was just as simple as that, and as hard as that. But it was an extraordinary culture. We had a remarkable leadership. And for me, I thrived in that environment because it was all about collective contribution. It was all about collective work. It was all about doing the best possible work for our clients and celebrating, appreciating the people that I worked with and supporting them in their development. Very open, honest, constructive feedback after literally preparation for every meeting, follow up after every meeting with constructive feedback for each person. Didn't matter if you were a partner or not. It was just a culture of, we want to do the best possible work for our clients, and we can only do that if we're our best selves. And so I was there for 17 years. It was just a remarkable experience for me. Fast forward, going into graduate school, working on my degree in organization dynamics, and really going deeper into leadership and really trying to understand, what does leadership mean, and what kinds of leaders are required, and where are they? And along the way, spending the last 30 years doing pro bono work in the nonprofit sector and seeing the leaders there and helping develop leaders. And then I guess it was probably around 2009, 2010, discovering what is now called conscious leadership, and really diving into that and forming a business with a colleague who was one of the people who had identified the term conscious leadership, and going deep into that space of conscious leadership, which is about, first, conscious, meaning I'm awake, I'm aware, I'm present to how others are experiencing me and how I'm showing up. And leadership, in part, meaning I take full responsibility for my actions. And for me, just it made sense to me for the first time of what kind of leadership do we need in the world. And not that it's the be all and end all. And we had a wonderful conversation on Wednesday around conscious leadership. But for me, it approximates what I think of as leadership. And so I've embraced that. It's been my quote unquote day job is bringing conscious leadership into the world for the last 14 years through my executive coaching work, through my business advisory work with boards of directors, leadership teams, and certainly the other things that I've done, whether it's the film production I've done or other activities. It's all about how do we get more conscious leadership into the world, truly believing that if we don't have it, we're not going to survive as a species. I mean, the systems that when we've talked about this week, the systems that we're all affected and shaped and influenced by, we can just be on remote control and not be aware of how they're shaping and influencing us. And so, part of that conscious piece is understanding the systems we're swimming in and how they're affecting us and how we're showing up. So I'll stop there, but that's a quick journey through my last 50 or 60 years.
Thank you so much. I have a few questions that emerge, and I'll circle back and ask those after we hear from George. George, welcome.
Thanks, Jim. And Tom, thanks. I have had the good fortune of collaborating with Tom in a number of areas, and I can say that he walks his talk, and that's a really wonderful thing, Like Tom, I can begin with my high school sports experience. I had the good fortune to be a quarterback on the football team and a point guard in basketball. And in both of those positions, I think we were the only high school football team in Massachusetts that actually called plays from the line of scrimmage. And I learned at that time how the decisions I made, both the good ones and the bad ones, greatly affected what happened to the team as a whole and the performance in a game. And the same with some of the formations and whatnot that I would respond to as a point guard on the basketball court. So I learned early that I could make a difference depending on what I did, and that what I did didn't always work. Later, after college, it was during the early stages of the Vietnam War, and I had a choice to go to Canada or find some excuse for not being a part of it. And I didn't find that matched who I was. So instead of being drafted into the Army, I went through an OCS program at Newport, Rhode Island for the Navy. And what's called leadership in the military is an unusual thing, you know. And so I learned from that experience. And then later, when I was a young ensign and lieutenant, junior grade, I had the privilege and the odd experience of working for a number of admirals at the highest level of naval command. And so I experienced a whole different aspect of leadership. From there, went on to a relatively brief but valuable career in running a marketing agency in New York. And at that time, I realized that we had about 65 clients. And I realized I was really in the consulting business then. Because my job was really to review their strategies and explore alternatives. And I didn't get into the people part of leadership. I was more on the conceptual side. But I understood that I liked that ability to influence and affect a variety of different organizations. I've been blessed in my life, the truth is. I've done so many damn things in so many different careers. And even though at the time I wasn't aware how they were going to contribute, in retrospect, each piece contributed a lot. I went on to a career in what's called transformational education. I designed and led and facilitated a lot of large transformational trainings, both for individuals and organizations. That led me into the corporate environment where I had the privilege of running a small boutique consulting firm, but we had extraordinary clients. And we competed along with the big eight, and oftentimes we could outcompete them because I didn't have the overhead and the structure that they did. And I also learned something, that by having a lean team and by not having huge overhead, I didn't have to stay around and extend jobs beyond the point that I thought we were being effective. And a lot of the firms we competed with did that because they had a lot of mouths to feed. Some great clients and some great opportunities. We were the primary consultants for NASA and Boeing on International Space Station, and we helped take that project from a backroom dumping ground for people and ideas that nobody knew what to do with, to the launching of what many people have called the eighth wonder of the world. 10,000 U.S. contractors, 16 international partners. It was a blast, really a blast. And then I got into a period of my career where I found myself becoming depressed by the work that I was doing, because I would find that our team would go in and develop great rapport and begin to build new levels of culture within organizations. And the culture would start producing good results, increased profitability and performance, and better relationships with customers and all the rest of that. But then I would find we would just get to the top of that pinnacle, and a new CEO or a new president would come in, and the next thing you know, they'd have a totally different agenda. It was profit, it was getting the company ready to sell or merge or something, and the entire previous experience would be washed away. So I left that business entirely behind and formed some nonprofits and Age Nation and some other companies, and here I am. I also had along the way a number of experiences in the political sector. I worked behind the scenes doing research on 2 presidential campaigns with an extraordinary partner from Canada who was an econometrician and the smartest man that I've ever had the privilege of working with. I managed some political campaigns, a U.S. Senate campaign in California, several mayoral campaigns, and then went back behind the scenes and did some consulting in 2 additional presidential campaigns. So the fact is, I've seen leadership in a number of its different manifestations. And when I look out at the world today, I am deeply saddened, angry, and upset at the abysmal quality of leadership that I see being executed too often in a number of major sectors. And at the same time, I'm thrilled when I encounter people like Bob and Jason yesterday and other people who I come across who really do outstanding work. So there we are.
Thank you so much. Between the 2 of you, you've covered the gamut of what leaders do in this modern world of ours. And I'd like to begin with each of you defining more explicitly what you mean by leadership. What do you think in the end constitutes a great leader? It's not such an easy thing to define. So I'd love to hear from both of you as to how you would define the essence of leadership as you've discovered it and experienced it over your careers.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Jim. I'll first by saying that great leaders are extraordinary and they're rare. So I'll speak to good leaders because the great leaders don't come along very often, and we're blessed when they do. But we can look throughout history at some of the people that history has recognized as great leaders, whether it's Dr. King or Gandhi or Nelson Mandela. Those are what I would call great leaders, and history is recognized as great leaders. At the end of the day, for me, what is a good leader? It goes back to what I was saying before. It's someone who is self-aware. They're keenly aware of how they're showing up and how they're affecting and influencing those, using Bob's language from yesterday, span of care. They're individuals who people want to follow. They're individuals that don't have their own agenda. They've got the genuine care and take responsibility for the people that are in their span of care, as Bob calls it, or span of control, or people that they're shaping and influencing their lives. And so for me, those are some of the qualities of a good leader. They're individuals who, most of my consulting work or my coaching work is with CEOs. And the challenge that every CEO I work with is looking around the corner. What are the challenges? What are the obstacles? What are the things that they don't even know exist, that the business is going to be challenged by, or the organization is going to be challenged by in the next 6 months, the next year, the next couple of years? Most organizations have given up doing strategic planning, looking beyond a fairly brief period of time. When I first came into the business world, organizations were doing 5-year strategic plans. And those are pretty much out the window now, because the nature of the world is so dynamic. We've seen the emergence of this term VUCA, volatile, uncertain, That's the nature of particularly for business, but it goes beyond business, the nonprofit sector, academia, the political or governmental sector. The landscape is so challenged that as a leader, one of the biggest responsibilities the CEOs I work with is trying to the best of their ability, making sense of what the future might be and where are the opportunities, where's the business direction. Bob talked yesterday about the importance of having a strong economic model. And for many organizations, many businesses, it's incredibly challenging. And so as a leader, how do you ensure that the financial viability of the business? How do you get a sense of where the world is going? And I've said it on a number of programs, the complexity of the problems we're facing today, there's not an individual leader in most organizations that can say, here's where we need to go and why. They need a whole team of people. They need the whole organization to be leaders. Everybody needs to and is being called to be a leader in the world today. And the responsibility of leaders of organizations is to equip the people in their organization to be leaders.
Yeah. Well, you're making a very insightful point, I think, to differentiate the great from the good. If you look over political history, there's only a handful of leaders that have been called like the great, like Alexander the Great. In all of British history, for example, there's only one that's been called great. That was Alfred the Great way back in the 8th century. And, you think of US history, you've got Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt that are considered great presidents, and the other 46 are kind of recede into mediocrity and various levels of distinction, but they're not great. And that's an intriguing notion. George, first of all, how would you distinguish between great and good leadership? And what would be your perspective on what characterizes an essential leader?
Well, I would say that there's steps on the same ladder. That somebody doesn't get to great without passing through good. That's first of all. And not only through passing through good, but through making a lot of mistakes, a lot of stumbles and whatnot. I think great and wisdom correlate with one another. And it takes a lot to develop wisdom rather than intelligence or any of the other sub-steps along the way. And I agree with Tom and with you to a degree, although I think that there are a number of people who, when history calls, stepped from good to great, maybe not forever, but for the time in which the spotlight was shining on them. That haberdasher from Missouri called Harry Truman that a lot of people denigrate, had to step into some extraordinary shoes and take on a period of transition that, depending on what he did one way or another, could have put us even more in the toilet than we already are, So anyway, that's for me the difference in good and great sometimes. I think essential qualities of leadership, I think good leaders are good people. They're good human beings. Not always in every category, but I think there are things like honesty and integrity and some level of, I'm going up on the word, but there's a consciousness, there's an awareness at some level, there's enough of a degree of compassion, and there's a genuine desire to serve and a commitment to the greater good. Now, those are some soft and fuzzy categories in some way, but core values and good character that's demonstrated seems to me to be the mark of a good human being. And someone who can admit mistakes, is receptive and willing to learn. So those are a hodgepodge of characters and qualities. Courage, the willing to persist, the willing to take uncharted paths rather than simply follow the herd. I mean, those all contribute, I think, to outstanding human beings, and therefore give someone a chance when they step into that role of leader to demonstrate some or all of those things.
You know, I think what you're saying is very true, and I would add there's a certain charism to a leader. Tom, you had mentioned earlier, you know, that the leader is the person that people want to follow. You know, you're thinking of Tom Sawyer, you know, painting the fence, and he turned a chore into an attractor. Next thing you knew, you had every kid in the neighborhood vying to paint that fence with him. And that can be for good or for ill. I mean, look at the charism of a Donald Trump or an Adolf Hitler. The charism of a leader can also have a deep, dark shadow side that can take an entire nation, as we saw with the Germans in the 30s, right off the cliff because of this extraordinary resonance in the energetic field between the leader and the led. And so I'd love to have both of you comment on that phenomenon of the leader as the charismatic. You know, you think of Martin Luther King when he spoke, even in the recordings years and years later, you just feel something happening in your body, and you just want to kind of give yourself to whatever that cause is. So how does that play in your experience into what constitutes a leader? And how did you manifest that in your time?
Yeah, I'll share a couple of things and tease out a bit more of what you were asking, Jim. So when I look at some of the extraordinary leaders I've had an opportunity to work with, we as human beings, and Dean Anderson touched on this on Wednesday, each of us has a way of being in the world. We have a mindset that shapes and influences. And we have a whole host of assumptions about things when we engage in an activity, about how they're going to turn out. And so for many leaders will they'll have a set of data that they'll create an assumption around that becomes a business strategy. And when they execute on it and the organization executes on it and it works as planned, a lot of the leaders I've worked with, well, they expected it to turn out okay. They expected it to be fine. And so they don't take the time, and we as human beings often do that. When it worked as planned, we don't take the time to examine, why did it actually work? But when it fails, we all will agonize over the detail of why did it fail and what was my role in it. And for some folks, they go into victim mode and they want to blame the other individuals, but we examine why we fail, but we don't necessarily take the time to examine why we succeeded. And the better leaders I've worked with have taken the time to examine both why did things not turn out as we planned, why did they turn out differently than we planned, and why did it succeed? And the better leaders that I've worked with take the time to do that, not just individually, but with their leadership team and with the organization. And there's a quality there of the leaders I've worked with that make that a priority. And picking up on that charismatic piece, the leaders I've worked with that have been exhibited more of the charismatic dimensions that you're talking about, it's the same thing. They're looking at and examining all of their behaviors. They're examining and they're practicing over and over and over and over again. Dr. King, as an orator, he wasn't just born that way. He had a lot of practice. And with Gandhi, and we speak to it in the Third Harmony film, Gandhi spent 17 years preparing for the Salt March. And so for many of these leaders who we, in retrospect, look at and think they're charismatic, they're extraordinary, They are, but they got there through lots of failure. They got there through lots of practice, and they continued to, not in a pejorative way, but continued to hone their craft and really look inside to say, what are the shadow sides of me, and how do I, shed some light on the shadow sides, and how do I continue to become more and more effective at who and what I am. And there is that X factor, and we've all witnessed it. And even some of the most extraordinary leaders I've worked with, I don't know that even with all the work they've done, they can point to what it is specifically created that X factor.
Yeah, it's a deep mystery. And you're right, it manifests itself in such different ways. You think of Gandhi, he wasn't an orator at all. People could barely hear him when he would speak. And here you have Martin Luther King, that would, I have a dream, that would resonate around the world as he engaged in such extraordinary oratory. So that X factor ultimately is a mystery. That's a very interesting notion. George, what would you say?
Well, Carl Jung had a lot to say about this topic, and he talked about the fact that some of the most charismatic figures are really performers, and oftentimes they are the individuals who create the greatest levels of betrayal. In part because I think there's a difference between organic charisma that flows from the goodness and the essence of the being, as certain spiritual leaders. The Dalai Lama, for an example, is someone whose joy and spontaneity and whatnot radiate from something inside. Whereas there are a lot of people in the political sector, in the entertainment sector, in the business sector, who have a switch that they turn on when they have an audience. And that switch is a face that they put on. It's a persona that they wear. And some of them have honed it so perfectly that people do become attracted and fall in love with them. There are a lot of entertainers who have that. They're dull as shit off stage, but all of a sudden the spotlight turns on and there's a radiance that comes out of them, So I think there's a huge difference between authentic charisma and performed or manufactured charisma. And so that for me is a distinct difference. I've had the privilege, as you have, and Tom has, of meeting and working with and spending time with some extraordinary human beings. I had early in my marketing career, I had an experience with Golda Meir, and she was on one level hard as nails, and at the other end of the spectrum, the consummate old crone and mother of wisdom. I had the privilege of spending some personal time with Desmond Tutu, and he was just a delight. He was just a delight. And to think of what he carried during the years that Nelson Mandela was in jail, and the way that he carried it was quite extraordinary. Just to sit with him was enlightening. I've had little known sadhus or teachers from India that I've sat with that the world never had any true recognition of, even though they had consequence in their home communities and in India, who I left feeling radiant and transformed just by being in their presence. As we're talking, I remember a night in an auditorium in Scottsdale, Arizona, where there were 20 or 30 well-known speakers and people of real repute and whatnot. And early in the evening, an unknown to most of us, Buddhist monk was asked to come on stage and give a blessing. And at the end of the evening, the only person I remembered was this Buddhist monk. You talk about it being a mystery. I think that it is. But I think genuine, true charisma is something that is deeply earned by inner work. And by comparison, someone mentioned it yesterday in the program that there are techniques that leaders learn. You know, they stop and they look you in the eye, and the handshake is firm, and they remember your birthday and all the rest of it. But behind it is nothing. It's empty. It's just a learned mechanism that somebody practices. Whereas the authentic thing comes through not only at an intellectual level, but at a genuine feeling level, where your heart's been touched because you know that the individual that you're meeting or talking to has genuine essence. And that, for me, is what I have to say about charisma.
Beautiful.
Maybe just picking up on that point. So there are lots of leaders who are called leaders because of the title and the position that they hold. And Celeste brought it into the conversation on Wednesday. She talked about embodied leadership. And we're starting to see more and more research, and it's an area I've been trained in. We're starting to see more and more organizations recognize what's now being called embodied leadership, where the leader recognizes, to picking up on what George was saying, getting beyond the position, the title of leader, and fully owning who they are and how they're showing up, and having developed the self-awareness around, are they in their body? And I'm not just talking about the physical body, I'm talking about emotional body, spiritual body, energetic body. And leaders who have honed that awareness and have that ability to bring all of them, their spiritual body, their energetic body, their physical body, their psychological, emotional body, to be fully present. We're getting closer to understanding what that looks like and how to develop that as an individual.
You know, if I can, too, I noticed someone in the chat made a comment about the fact that we haven't been talking about women leaders, with the exception of my mentioning Golda. And I think that's also important. You know, it's important to remember that there have been a huge number of women leaders who have changed the course of history. And some, because of that inner essence, that multiplicity of physical and emotional and spiritual bodies that Tom just talked about. I had an experience a number of years ago. I was in Spain, and I was visiting Avila, one of the old walled cities, which was the place where Saint Teresa lived. And I spent some time in this little cell that she had lived in, a dirt floor cell. And it was an off time of day, and I got to spend about 30 minutes there by myself. And that was an instance where decades, centuries after Saint Teresa lived, her presence was as alive in that cell for me in that moment as any physical presence that I've ever experienced. So that's the other thing. Authenticity doesn't disappear. It stays present, whereas the more superficial stuff vanishes almost as soon as one's eyes is off of the the individual or the image. So I just want Kathleen or whoever it was that mentioned that to know that we are fully aware that there are extraordinary women, leaders who have changed the course of history as well.
Yeah, maybe just picking up on that. By choice, when I first started doing executive coaching, I made a commitment to myself that from a gender dimension, half of the CEOs I would coach would be women. And it's been extraordinary for me over the last 14 years to look at the women that I've coached and help them become more effective leaders. And certainly understanding the dynamics of what it means to be a woman in the business world or in the nonprofit world or in academia, and both the conscious and unconscious bias, the history, all of the obstacles that they have to overcome, but also see the extraordinary gifts and the perspectives that they bring. And it's a delight for me to help them be effective leaders, but also it's an extraordinary gift each of them give me in understanding and the challenges that they're facing and the gifts that they bring. And so it's been I'm delighted that I made that commitment many years ago.
Yes, that there are many different kinds of leaderships. I want to circle back to a remark that you made earlier, George, about making mistakes. Because as I look back on my life and career, it's largely been through some of the worst mistakes that I've been able to learn the most. And I'm wondering, each of you, as you look back on your careers, what mistake did you learn the most from as you honed your leadership?
Well, that's for me at least, that's a tough question because I've made a lot of mistakes.
It's hard to choose. Me too. Let's just pick one.
I think there's a category of mistakes, Jim, where I have let people down, where I haven't showed up in a way that in retrospect sometimes, or sometimes instantaneously, I recognize were not, those instances were not in keeping with the things that I believe or the things that I understood. Sometimes it was out of fear of exposure. Sometimes it was out of having to take a risk beyond a place that I was comfortable. But I think those are the things that, in some ways, no matter how many times I have reviewed them, no matter how many times I've forgiven myself or asked for forgiveness for them, they remain an indelible list against which I measure my performance each day.
Yeah, beautifully put.
Yeah,
the times when we just didn't show up in the way that we knew intuitively we could, we just somehow couldn't. I've got a few stories like that that still sear my memory, my conscience when I think about them. Tom, what would you say?
Like you both have said, I've got an extraordinarily long list of failures. And they all haunt me. If I were, to go to the core of where many of those failures have emanated from, I hold myself to an extraordinarily high standard, and I've always assumed that others operate in the world in the same way, and that's an assumption that I've made repeatedly throughout my life, and it's contributed. And with that assumption that others are holding themselves at that same level, I override my intuition, and have done that repeatedly, and trusted, and allowed trust in particular to override my intuition. And when I've When I failed as a leader, it's not accepting or recognizing people for where they are, and having an open, candid, honest conversation about, here's what I assumed, but here's what I'm observing, and let's talk about it. And it's resulted in some of my biggest failures in life.
Boy, I can relate to that. Oh, wow. I think if I had to pick mine, it would be what you just stated, Tom. You make assumptions about people, and that turn out to be wrong. And because you've made assumptions, you override your intuition.
Yep.
And that's a deep one. That's a very, very, very deep one. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Let me turn to another thing that's just coming to my mind. I want to start this with a story of leadership, but it's so counterintuitive to what we think of as a leader. But I'd like to explore it because I think this is the kind of leadership we need in the world today. So I want to take everybody back to 1965. And I was a missionary kid in Taiwan. My parents were missionaries, Baptist missionaries. And they decided instead of going across the Pacific from Taiwan to San Francisco, they would go west across Asia and Europe, because they had a family of 4 kids and they wanted to show us the world. And so my dad, who was a poor missionary, he borrowed a little bit of money from a brother who was a very wealthy real estate developer in the States, and off we went. And we flew into Calcutta. And I can still remember coming out of the airplane. It was 117 degrees. And we went to a hostel there. It was a missionary-run hostel, and we were having dinner. And my dad was asking the other missionaries, so we only have 2 days in Calcutta before we have to fly in. What should we see? And he says, well, there's a lot of temples and so forth, but I want, there's been this nun that is starting to catch people's attention. And you may want to go visit her. And she just goes around picking up the babies that have been left to die. And my father was intrigued, and I can still remember he first verified that she was Catholic. And, as a Protestant in those days, you didn't believe the Catholics were going to go to heaven, and the Catholics didn't think the Protestants were going to go to heaven. So he was very skeptical. But the other missionary said, no, you should go out and meet her. So the next day, we took a taxi and we went close to the place, and we couldn't quite get down into where she was. And we had to get out of the taxi. And I can remember as we were walking along a street that was littered with people lying there. And one of them was dead. And I held my father's hand and said, Dad, is he dead? And my dad peered down and said, yeah, I think so. Let's hurry on. And we went to this place, a little house in this kind of slum. And there was some Catholic nuns that were washing babies from all the dirt and wrapping them up and putting them in little cribs and kind of walking around. And it was such a stark contrast to there. And one of them came up to us and said, hello, have you come to visit? You're welcome. I'm Mother Teresa. And she took us around and was infinitely kind and was taking care of all the little babies. And she say, we're saving babies here for Jesus. And I've never forgot that moment in my life. The contrast between the darkness and the cruelties of the world, and someone who would just make it her mission to save the most unfortunate. And I think one of the things I learned about leadership through that is that it is servant leadership. It's the leadership that takes an inexhaustible problem or pain and just sheds as much light on it as you possibly can. And out of that, obviously, Mother Teresa emerged as Mother Teresa. I had the good fortune of meeting her before she was recognized as Mother Teresa. But I still remember the dinner where that other missionary said, you know, there's this woman that you should meet because she was clearly radiating something. So I wanted to bring in that aspect of leadership into our conversation, because as I look around the world, it's the alpha males that are at the top of the corporations and at the top of the governments. They're the ones that are causing all the problems. You know, it's the Greta Thunbergs, it's the other ones that are just with infinite humility, dealing with different social problems that are actually manifesting the leadership that we so desperately need. So I just wonder how both of you would respond to this notion of servant leadership and the humility of true leadership, as opposed to the kind of the superstar kind of leadership.
Yeah, it's what I spoke to earlier about everybody in the world is being asked to be a leader today. And when I lived in the Bay Area on Friday mornings, there was a small group of us who would get together, and each person would be given a responsibility or would sign up for what they were going to bring. And we would go to the Mission District in San Francisco. And, you know, I would wake up at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, drive in, and there was just a half dozen of us that would meet on Fridays. And we would make breakfast, and there would be 60 homeless people that would be given tickets for breakfast. Wow. And typically there would be about 90. So we would make breakfast for 90, even though only 60 were given tickets. And we would set up tables. We would put down real plates, real glasses, real silverware, real napkins, and we would prepare breakfast for the homeless people that would show up. And it's really important to, just in terms of when we create a label for people, we're othering them. And so it was really important for the core group of us that these were human beings having a homeless experience. And so we would prepare breakfast and have coffee and tea. And once everyone was served, we would sit down with them and just spend a half hour, 45 minutes until they finished their breakfast. And what we were doing was helping them in that moment regain their sense of identity, their sense of human beings, and not being homeless people and the stigma that comes with that. And the leadership that was present with this group, it was a collective leadership. There wasn't anybody in charge. Each of us would just share responsibility for preparing the eggs or whatever was being served that morning. And for me, it was an extraordinary experience to, I would be finished by 9 o'clock, and then I would get on with my day. And each of us who would participate in that activity, same thing. But we would leave with this extraordinary gift that we were given of that shared leadership and of that sense of being of service to other.
Beautiful story. Thank you. Thank you.
I have three quick stories that speak to the essence, I think, too. One is with Mother Teresa at a much later stage in her life. I helped start and run a nonprofit organization called the International Integrity Foundation. And one of the ways that we spoke about integrity, especially personal integrity, was that we honored people in the world who represented what we thought was the essence of personal integrity. And one year, Mother Teresa was one of our honorees. And she was going to be in the US, but she was only going to be in New York, and she couldn't come to LA at the same time to receive the award. So we brought the award to her in New York, and she was backstage at an event, and that's when we made the presentation to her. And after she received the award, she made some comment about the fact that she was one of her novitiates, or young nuns, said to her, what's going on, Mother? And she said, oh, I'm a little bit tired tonight. And so this young girl with great optimism said, well, I know you always say God never gives us more than we can handle. And Mother Teresa said to her, there are days I wish he didn't have as much confidence in me as another quick story, a year or so after that, one of the opportunities I had to be with Desmond Tutu is we honored him. And he and his wife came to Los Angeles. And while there, we did a variety of talk shows around the country. And one of them was the Today Show. And so we got up at, I don't know, 5 o'clock in the morning to go to the studio and get all ready and whatnot. And after we did that, we had another show later, a Los Angeles morning show, but we went back to the hotel, and they went to their room and I went to mine. And when we got back together, I said to him, I said, boy, I really needed a nap. And he said, oh, I went out for a short run. And I said to him, Desmond, I said, how do you maintain this gracious, good humor and balance? I said, with all that you're dealing with in South Africa. And he said, you know, George, he said, I look with great compassion on the Afrikaners. He said, because they know their time is up and the world knows that their time is up. And if I were them, I would be very afraid as well. He said, so that understanding allows me to keep my good humor and to keep moving forward in life. And at the other end of the spectrum, one other story came to mind as you were both talking. I was doing an executive retreat. And on this occasion, the executive team decided to randomly pick a variety of people at other levels of the company to bring with them on this retreat. And at one point, the CEO of this company was standing at the front of the group talking about inspiration and happiness and joy and all the rest of it. And this guy from the back of the group, who worked in the mailroom, whose name was Joe, yelled out, "Why don't you tell your face?" And there was absolute silence in this group. And the CEO knew that he had just been tagged for talking about something that he wasn't personally expressing. And to his credit, after this silence where somebody thought maybe he was going to take this kid's head off, he looked at him and he smiled and he said, "Joe, that's the best thing that's happened to me all day." So leadership comes from different places. And I think that it's always when somebody is in service to truth, and in service in general, that a level of leadership that can change humanity manifests itself.
Mm.
So that's
Beautifully put, George and Tom, your story. Thank you both so much. And I think it's within this context of the richness that you've described for us of the dimensionality of leadership that we should take up the challenge of leadership in government in the time that we have remaining, because we have a plethora of leaders in all kinds of ways, and we've just named a fraction of the leaders that are out there, large and small, young and old, men and women, etc. We just saw how someone from the mailroom, led the leader, led the CEO. And yet, universally today, it seems that our governments are showing themselves almost universally to be either incapable or unwilling to lead at a moment when government leadership to solve some of our major problems like climate change are absolutely essential. So as leaders, as people deeply immersed in this leadership sort of business and domain, first, how do you understand the dysfunctionality happening at the level of governments? Then we'll turn to what we can do about it. But I mean, just as how do you understand the failure of leadership going on out there right now? And it's just not an American phenomenon. It seems to be a global phenomenon. And our problems, therefore, continue to spin out of control. How are you understanding that from the point of view of leadership?
I'll share a couple of different perspectives. So first, I want to honor and celebrate the extraordinary leadership we're seeing around the world, particularly with women leaders. When I look at the Prime Minister of New Zealand, I look at Angela Merkel, and we can go down the list of extraordinary women leaders around the world and what they've done. They have been under-recognized for their extraordinary leadership. And I'm immensely grateful that the world has shifted, that there is a receptivity, there is the ability for women to rise in leadership roles in the private sector and in the public sector. And so I think we would do a disservice not to celebrate and recognize the extraordinary leadership that's happening around the world, particularly with some of the elected women leaders in the world. Putting that aside, the government has always been in a reactive position. We've always seen government and our elected officials come to the party late in putting in the policies, the procedures, the laws, the restrictions, the guidelines that are necessary. And it's always, from my perspective, government in most situations has been reactive too. Once there's a problem, then it becomes, particularly here in the US, a law. At the local level, we've got several hundred mayors who have been demonstrating leadership, who really have taken on climate change. Because at the local level, you can talk to any mayor. There's no such thing as Republican, Independent, Democrat. They can't govern, they can't lead if they're attached to a particular party, a particular agenda. They're quickly voted out of office. So once again, I want to celebrate and recognize we've got several hundred leaders, mayors in particular in the US, who are leading around climate change, who are leading around some of these complex, incredible problems. If we get to the national level here in the US, and I think in many countries around the world, the systems that are in place seemingly make it impossible. I mean, I mentioned on a couple of occasions Glasgow last fall and the COP26. And our world leaders failed us miserably. And the gift that came out of that was the people who were there, the young people, we've recognized that it's up to us to lead. We can't count on our leaders, particularly on climate change, but it extends to many of the other issues and problems. And I think it's an acknowledgement that we all are leaders now. We're all being asked to be leaders, and we can't count on our elected officials to lead. The political system that the elected officials here in the US are operating in make it seemingly impossible for them to lead. You know, they're spending most of their time raising money. You know, I don't know what the current daily rate is, but you know, at one point not too long ago, a US senator had to raise $200,000 a day for their next campaign. The House of Representatives are probably something close to that. So in that very short time period of 2 years, they're spending most of their time fundraising. And so that dynamic is a critical issue. It's a critical problem. The piece that, you know, when I define conscious leadership about taking responsibility, we're not seeing our elected officials here in the US taking responsibility for their actions. Mm. And that's a huge problem. So I'll touch on those pieces first and then turn it over to George.
Well, I can't disagree at all over the question that leadership is in pretty abysmal conditions today, here in America and around the world. I approach it, however, I think from a slightly different point of view. I agree with Tom when he talks about the system in which many leaders function today, whether in the corporate environment and the economic pressures and levers that people press to control them, as well as in the political sector. At the time I was running a U.S. Senate campaign in California in the mid-1980s, the amount of money that needed to be raised was between $25 and $40 million to run a campaign. So the numbers are far exceeding that today, you know. And presidential campaigns, we are talking about multi-billions of dollars that each candidate spends to even stay in the race. But I don't think we've gotten here quickly. I think this has been an evolving problem. I think when the Industrial Revolution happened and we began to step off of the path of the wisdom traditions, we set in motion the elements that we are now, the poison fruit that we are now being forced to eat. And I don't blame our leaders as much as I used to. I blame us, we the people. I think we have failed miserably to be responsible for our role, our authority, and our responsibility as citizens. We have turned away to focus on our own individual lives largely. And so we have left the field almost as though, to use another analogy, it's as though we have allowed the inmates to take control of the asylum. And each day I become more saddened and fascinated by the lack of willingness on the part of we the people to regain control over our institutions, over our businesses, and over our government. We sit by on the sidelines largely as if we were watching some kind of reality television program. And those individuals who are in conscious leadership positions in business and government and institutions are left largely to fend for themselves in a system that is obviously corrupt and failing. There's little doubt that if our society, if democracy, if our habitat, if humanity in general come to an end, it is because we, the people, have colluded in that demise, without question in my mind. And I believe the only way democracy and humanity and the other species and our environment can be saved, if that's still possible, is if we, the people, step up big time in massive numbers and agree, like that character in Network that Peter Finch played, that we are all willing simultaneously to open our doors and windows and say, we've had enough, we're not going to take it anymore, and this is what has to happen. Until we regain control over the institutions and the businesses and the government that serve us, they are left to play whatever game they choose to play. They set their own levels in government. They set their own salaries. They set their own work hours. They set their own goals. They set their own retirement benefits. But they work for us, and we've forgotten that, and they've forgotten it. So if we want better leadership in the world, not only do we need to do what Tom said and what you've said repeatedly, Jim, each one of us has to become our own leader, but collectively we have to begin to demonstrate our responsibility as human beings. And that's the only thing that's going to change this circumstance, in my opinion.
Yeah, George, I don't disagree with anything you said, but there's a nuance to it that I think we need to acknowledge. So the complexity of the problems we're facing as a species are so extreme that it's seemingly impossible for any one of us to think, what can I do about climate change? What can I do about social injustice? What can I do about the war in the Ukraine? What can I do? And people are overwhelmed by it. And there's this knee-jerk reaction that we're seeing to electing a Bolsonaro, electing some of these autocrats who say, I have the answer, and people are overwhelmed by not knowing how to approach it, that they're willing to, as like an adolescent, when they get themselves in trouble, to turn to a parent to say, you're the authority, please help fix this. And when those leaders are stepping forward saying, I can do it, I've got the answer, there's a lot of folks who are saying, please fix this problem. So that's one piece of it. A second piece of it is that when people, individual citizens, feel like the game is rigged, that it's stacked against them, then there's an automatic response to, I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to get my own. And so we've got that piece that's going on as well. And, having been a student of organizations, I've seen it in organizations where individuals are, because they've got a mortgage, they've got kids that they're trying to put through school, they're just doing their job. And, we can talk about government, we can talk about organizations, but it's just a collection of people. And if the individuals don't feel like they can affect change, they feel like they've got their own agenda, that the deck is stacked against them, then we see the kind of behavior that we're seeing. And I can't disagree with what you said, George, about we have to, as individuals, say we're not going to take it anymore. But it's hard when folks feel like they're incapable of making a difference.
I agree, Tom. It is a complicated environment, and there are a lot of nuances. And I know that what you've described about people feeling like the system is rigged or they're powerless plays an important role in the, I will call it the denial and the indifference of our time. But at the same time, there's an old cliche that says you can never con an honest man. And one of the reasons you can never con an honest man is an honest man admits what he or she does not know, and they admit where they're feeling powerless. They don't simply put their head down and go about the business of the business of life. And so I don't, at my deepest level, I don't buy the excuses that I've given myself at times in my life, and that today I watch a lot of citizens in this country at least give for the reasons for not getting involved. Because I can tell from my own life experience that the price I am unwilling to pay today gets greater tomorrow. And if I don't know that already, there is only one way to fix this circumstance, and it is a peaceful revolution. It is only when we, the people, not only say I've had enough and I'm not going to take it anymore, but that we quietly, with love in our hearts, go out into the street in mass, and we bring this disgusting mechanism that is destroying humanity to a halt. We saw in the early stages of the pandemic how quickly things could change when people stopped doing their ordinary stuff. Not only did the environment begin to regenerate in various ways, people began to remember what it was like being human beings and being engaged with their families and other things. What did it take? A month of the pandemic for people to be stunned by what the changes were? We could create a pandemic of compassion by going out into the streets and saying, no more. You will listen or you will be gone, but this machine don't move 1 inch forward until we come to a different resolution. So that's my summation to this mess that we're in. And I don't in any way deny the truth of what you say about how hopeless so many people feel, how the system is rigged so that people have become economic prisoners of a system that is deadly to humanity. But I think we are the only ones who can yell stop.
Yeah, and we can look through history where that's happened. And there are lots of examples. I mean, with the work of Gandhi in having the British leave India.
Yeah.
And we can point to many, many other examples where it can happen, but I'm not sure I'm seeing that happening anywhere. And we're not holding our elected officials responsible.
Yeah. The other thing that we do, I think, Tom, is that when we do have them on the ropes, there was a moment in the George Floyd aftermath when so many millions of people were on the streets. And then some leaders started making and mumbling promises of change and police reform and all the rest of it. And we didn't stay in the streets long enough. We needed to see that legislation written and effected, and that's when we should have gone home. The story of Rome is an example. Roman generals used to go off with their armies and conquer half the known world. And they would come back and they would camp outside of Rome. And one of the things they were waiting for was that the Senate had to authorize them having a great parade and celebration, marching their armies through the city. But the senators always delayed because the generals had to pay for their own armies. And as soon as the generals couldn't pay anymore and the army dissipated and the general no longer imposed a threat, they used to let the poor fools come through town for some flag waving and some celebration, but they were toothless by that time. So when we decide to bring America to a halt, we have to know we have to stay in the streets until the senators come to us and beg us to allow them to remain in office. That's the key to our survival.
Leadership is revolution.
In some ways it is. In some ways it is.
Well, gentlemen, this has been a marvelous dialogue today. Thank you so much. I'd like to just close given what George just said, and it's been reflected in a number of the chats that, if the governments aren't going to do this, everyone, we've got to kind of do it ourselves. I think that's the essence of what George is saying. And I think what Tom is also saying. So my final question to you is, what quality of leadership would you each say is particularly important right now in a world situation where urgent leadership is needed? It's not being provided by the mechanisms of governance we have designed for that. The people need to now move forward. But what quality of leadership needs to be manifested in the world today?
What immediately comes to mind for me is leadership that creates safety for the individuals that they're responsible for, be it in the public sector or in the private sector, nonprofit, academia, to allow the brilliance and the leadership of the people that they're responsible for to come forward with their creativity, to come forward with their energy, their ideas, and to support and foster that.
Yeah, we have to make people feel safe in what they're doing. That's a very good point. That's a very good point. George?
I would say that what's most needed is honesty, humility, an end to the Superman or Superwoman complex, where a leader stops pretending that they have the capacity to cure all ills and take on all problems, and invite the people of this country or any country to say, this is something we need to do together. The responsibility for the ills that we face it's not mine, it's not hers, it's ours. And the cure for it is ours. Right now, Biden is being beaten over the head with a stick because gas prices are rising, or supply chain problems, which is really an excuse for price gouging, is limiting people's ability, and it's all his fault. Whereas if he simply said, hey, folks, we have a problem, and that problem needs to be resolved by all of us. We got to tighten our belts. We got to find new solutions. And I'm not going to do it alone. I'm not going to be your, what's that piñata that you're going to hang on a tree and then beat to death with a stick to get your candy out of. This is your problem as well as mine. And that's the kind of leadership I think that will get us. That's what Roosevelt did in the Second World War. That's what Washington did. We have to make it all of our problems and all of our solutions, and do it with humility and honestly, and maybe we can make it.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. We're all in this together, everyone. And that's humanity rising with courage and humility and authenticity and a deep commitment to the future generations yet unborn. Tom, George, I can't express my gratitude to you enough for the quality of discourse that we've had today, but also for the quality of leadership that both of you have brought to our Humanity Rising programs. I'm deeply grateful, as I know the entire Humanity Rising community is. And just so everybody knows, next week, Tom and George are continuing with a convening on the issue of democracy in America, and with the kind of leadership that is required from activists around the country and around the world to preserve democracy, not only in the United States, but globally, in country after country, whether it's Brazil or Hungary or India. All of us are challenged in very deep ways and need to lead in completely new and innovative ways to preserve the institutions of democracy that have been fashioned so painstakingly over so many centuries.
Jim,
So
I
thank
don't
you,
want,
gentlemen.
wait, before we do, Tom and I also recognize that what you do on this program is also demonstrate a remarkable quality of leadership.
Thank you.
You create an opportunity and a space for people. What is it now, 1,750 or 1,800 people over this last period of time to come and share their thoughts and their hopes and their dreams and their precisions and confusions with the world. The way you orchestrated this program is a beautiful demonstration of leadership. And I don't want that to go unpassed or unrecognized. And I also want to admit that and let people know that next week as well, that the programs have been helped and supported by John Steiner and Margot King, and they have played a big role in the Democracy series and need to be really recognized and rewarded for that, or acknowledged for it. Thank you.
And I'll pile on, Jim, just to say, what you and the team have created with Humanity Rising is an extraordinary gift to the audience who participates, but also to the rest of the quote unquote industry that's bringing this kind of dialogue and this kind of exchange to the world. And my desire, my hope is that it does shape and influence the other broadcasters, the other organizations out there, and that there's an opportunity to see the kind of dialogue and conversation that happens on Humanity Rising. So thank you for your leadership, and thank you for this gift.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, George. I think the one word I would say as I acknowledge this affirmation is that I have a deep belief in humanity. And I believe very fundamentally that we're in a moment where all of us need to lead in every way that is given to us, large or small, holding hands together with others that are seeking consciously to lead in a very, very complex world where the questions and the unknowns overwhelm us day by day, but nevertheless, we're called upon to act. And I just want to salute the two of you. I want to salute all of you in the Humanity Rising community, all of you in the chats today that are expressing your points of view. All comes together in a way that we're going to be surprised that the solutions will emerge out of our collective efforts. And that will be what saves us in the end, is that humanity will have risen together. So thank you for that. You're all welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the link in the chat box. Stan and Shannon will be leading those discussions, and we'll see you again on Monday for another 5-day program on the crisis of democracy. Tthank you, everyone. Bye for now. Have a good weekend.